There are bad actors who have stirred up a conversation, spurious conversation about censorship that some high-profile comedians, including people like Dave Chappelle and Jimmy Carr, have participated in. So imagine my surprise to find out that, having talked so much about how important free speech is, that they would go and perform funded by a government that is telling them that there are subjects they can and can't talk about on stage.
Hi everyone, Niall Paterson, host of the Sky News Daily podcast here. Do hope this finds you well. We've had quite a busy week on the Daily, in fact, covering everything from the collapse of that Chinese spy trial all the way to the very sad news of the England rugby star Lewis Moody's diagnosis of motor neurone disease. Now, if you want to find any of those episodes, just click on the card that's appeared in the top right to follow the podcast. Today, though, on this occasion, we thought we'd start talking about the comedy festival that left people with precious little to laugh at. And if you are looking for a stellar lineup of comedians, well, you won't find many better than this. It included the Americans Dave Chappelle, Louis C.K., Bill Burr and Aziz Ansari, amongst others. There were Brits there too, flying the flag: Jimmy Carr, Jack Whitehall and Omid Jalili. The problem is that the gig was the first Riyadh comedy festival in Saudi Arabia, a nation, well, not best known for its freedom of speech. In fact, it's rather better known for the subordination of women, the killing of journalists, and at least 283 executions this year so far. You might think it might be difficult to find the laughs in any of that, though pay packets that would make a banker blush seem to have made it a bit easier for those comedians who chose to perform. Not all who were invited did, though. In fact, many believe these comics should never have gone in the first place. Once we had sports washing, using sport to distract from things like your utterly tarnished record on human rights. So, was the Riyadh Festival just an example of comedy washing? Or was it, as those who attended say, the beginning of a dialogue that will lead to meaningful change? Well, to find out, I spoke to Nish Kumar, one of the UK's best known and loved comedians, also host of the Pod Save the UK podcast. Nish, great to have you with us. Look, give me an honest answer to this one. Is there any amount of money in the world that would have compelled you to perform at the Riyadh Comedy Festival?
Well, you've asked, I think, probably the question that everybody in the English-speaking comedy world has been asked of themselves. I'm in the sort of privileged position of not having been invited, and so feeling maybe more emboldened to speak on this particular subject. I honestly don't know if there is an amount of money that would have compelled me to do it. I mean, I would like to think there isn't an amount of money that would compel me to go to Riyadh. I suspect, given some of the things that I've said about the Saudi regime and their track record on dealing with people who are critical of them, I suspect even if I was invited, it's an invitation I would be wary of saying yes to, in case the whole thing was some sort of sting operation.
For very obvious reasons. But
Yeah.
you said they're surprised. I mean, I was surprised at the cast list that were able to go and were able to compartmentalise their opposition.
I think people should just be very clear about what this is. You know, if you tour generally, wherever I've toured in the last year and a half, I go there and I'm paid by the audience members in the tickets that they buy. I'm not on a guarantee of anything. I went and did a tour of the States and Canada and Australia and New Zealand, and obviously the UK and Ireland as well, where I am regularly touring. The money comes from ticket buyers, whereas this is a whole initiative that has been financed by the GEA, which is the General Entertainment Authority, that gets its money from the Saudi Arabian government. So then you do have to ask, what is the ethical position that this government is taking? Because it isn't as simple as I've seen a lot of people say, well, I went out there to perform for the people of Saudi Arabia. But the reality is the checks are being cut by the General Entertainment Authority. But also there is this practice of insert name of activity and then the word washing. So whether it's sport washing or culture washing, there is also an element of reputational management that this kind of thing absolutely achieves. And it has successfully achieved that in Dubai, for example. The normalization of Qatar, the normalization of Abu Dhabi, a lot of that has been achieved by investment in culture, investment in the arts, investment in sports. So do you want to be a part of that? That's the question I think you have to ask.
Of course, to participate in the Riyadh Comedy Festival, you had to sign a contract, and a contract which stipulated things that you could not talk about: the royal family, Islam. You could not mock, the country's government. I mean, just as a comedian, well, first of all, have you ever been asked to kind of sign a contract like that? And secondly, would you ever sign a contract like that?
I've never been asked to sign a contract for anything as far I mean I will say I am also incredibly administratively haphazard, so it's possible that I've signed a contract without realizing it. So if I have, I will caveat this by saying I am congenitally incompetent. So it's possible that I've signed it, but I've certainly not abided by it at any point in my career if I have signed it. And so yeah, so I think that there's two channels to this. So we've talked about one, which is the kind of engagement. Why are they doing this? What are you participating in? Then there is this kind of freedom of speech question. And I'd sort of, again, I've read a lot of think pieces and posts on social media accounts by people who have gone to do this. And they've said that this is, an attempt to reach the people and, it's part of engagement with the region. And I don't know how much you're reaching the people if you're only participating in a conversation that happens around parameters that are set by the government, and also some of the people involved, some of the very high profile names on this list have been involved in a very, very tedious conversation in the last decade about cancel culture and things that comedians can and can't say.
Well,
and
let's name one of them, Dave Chappelle, and the man who certainly is not in need of any money at all. So
100%, yeah.
He clearly is arguing that he went there for the reasons that you're now arguing against.
Yeah, and there's been a sort of tedious back and forth about cancel culture to the extent where, like, I can't, like, if I get in a cab or I'm at the hairdressers or anything, and somebody asks me what I do, and I say I'm a comedian, they say, "Oh, that must be very difficult now because of all of this cancel culture." That's the extent to which, it's. When I was starting in comedy, if you told somebody you're a comedian, they'd say, "Tell us a joke then," and you'd roll your eyes and think, "My God, this is the worst." I yearn for the days of "Tell us a joke" because it pivots now immediately to, well, it must be hard to do things because of cancel culture. And I've always maintained that I think that, it's an awkward conversation. We're in an eggy place because we have absolute freedom of speech. Not only do we have absolute freedom of speech, we are all broadcasters now because of, podcasting and the internet and social media. So we're having conversations, grown-up conversations about what is responsible to say. But I am absolute in my commitment that governments should not legislate around freedom of speech. And I think we've got ourselves, in broadly a pretty good place in that, you can't actively incite violence, but other than that, you can kind of say whatever you want. And certainly as a comedian, I'm sort of free to say whatever I want. Now, a lot of these people have, whether knowingly or not, become patsies in a conservative moral hysteria that has been whipped up in the interest of bad faith actors in our body politic in the United Kingdom and the United States of America, particularly. There are bad actors who have stirred up a conversation, spurious conversation about censorship that some high-profile comedians, including people like Dave Chappelle and Jimmy Carr, have participated in. So imagine my surprise to find out that, having talked so much about how important free speech is, that they would go and perform in a show funded by a government that is telling them that there are subjects they can and can't talk about on stage. That, to me, seems like a supreme act of hypocrisy. And also, Saudi Arabia has form in terms of restricting what comedians can and can't say, not just within the boundaries of its country. So in 2019, they pulled an episode of Hassan Minhaj's Patriot Act on Netflix. Now, that wasn't pulled globally. It was just pulled in Saudi Arabia. That entire episode was about the idea that Mohammed bin Salman is presiding over a liberalized regime in Saudi Arabia. The idea that he was trying to propagate is that he is a kind of Western educated liberal who is changing Saudi Arabia, making it more liberal. But that was completely blown out of the water by the aforementioned brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi. So Hassan actually did an episode about this. And at the request of the Saudi government, it was pulled by Netflix in Saudi Arabia. If the premise is we're bringing comedy to these people and we're going to liberalize them with our fantastic comedy, that there is no evidence that that is happening. And if anything, the evidence is that they are pulling things from streaming services that are critical of the regime. They are stopping comedians from talking about issues that might lead to people talking about, free expression, freedom of speech. So there's a problem there.
It hasn't always been kind of like the hidden truth of the life of a comedian, that there are, particularly in the earlier stages of your career, there are gigs that you have to do for the money, that there is a corporate network of gigs that even professional comedians like you, at the top of their game like you will still dip into. And when you do those gigs for, a big bank, a multinational of some kind, maybe it's not written into your contract, but there's an unwritten line, there's an unwritten rule, there is an unseen line perhaps over which you would probably not stray because you're getting paid for it.
You make a lot of very good and valid points. Unfortunately, they do not directly apply to me because, again, I'm going to shock you. I do not get asked to do corporates for the banking industry.
Strangely enough, yeah, thinking about that for a second.
I don't, the last corporate that I did was, as I say these things sometimes, I feel that I've become a parody of myself. But the last corporate I did was the Renewable Energy Awards. That was the last corporate that I did. But yeah, there are points where I think there are points where you kind of go, where has this money come from? Is it ethically right for me to do this? What I would say is most of the names on this list do not need the money. They are very, very affluent. I saw there's people who've talked about, there are lower profile comedians on the bill or people who have, been removed from the bill who did talk about the money as being life-changing. But I think for a lot of the most high profile people on this list, they don't need that money. This is not life-changing money for them. And I sort of fail to see why they have decided to say yes to this, because if you don't need the money, you're going there for the experience. But the experience of performing in Saudi Arabia is compromised by the various contractual stipulations on what you can and can't talk about. So I'm not angry. I'm just confused. I think.
Just elaborate a bit more on that. I mean, what do you think of those that you'll know personally? I mean, you mentioned Jimmy Carr. I'm sure you bumped into him on the circuit. Omid Jalili, of course, was over there as well. I mean, what do you think of these guys? I mean, I read Omid's piece in The Guardian where he defended his decision to go there, and it concluded with, I'll be back here. I'll be back there soon. Just hope none of the shows are axed. I mean, when you read that, when you see him going there, these are your contemporaries. How do you feel?
I've got no problem in voicing my displeasure with the things that my co-workers do, and I'm sure I will get into it, as I have done with Jimmy Carr, on a number of things that he has done in the last couple of years. I have no compunction with talking about that to his face. I have brought stuff up with him before. I will do it again. He's engaged in a string of activities recently that I have deep, profound moral and philosophical problems with that transcend, listen, I don't mind upsetting Jimmy Carr. I've done it before and I'll do it again.
Fair enough. But just talking about your own kind of style of comedy and the gigs that you've played away, of course, from Saudi Arabia. I mean, have you ever found yourself censored, or indeed have you ever found yourself censoring yourself? Like not telling jokes to a specific audience, or steering away from material, given what's going on that day in the news, or just the people who are sitting in front of you?
No, I mean, I think that I'm very fortunate in that I've come to a position in my career where largely people who come to see me know what they're getting into. People that come to see me expect a certain amount of discussion about contemporary issues, and there are gigs that I've done where I thought it might have been better for me to censor myself because I've upset people. But, I broadly, I've not felt any pushback. I mean, I felt a tremendous amount of pushback. This is outside of the realms of doing stand-up, but there was a tremendous amount of pushback. I hosted a satirical show on the BBC from 2007 to 2020, and I will say there was tremendous vociferous pushback to that, which was the MASH report. I was told that the show was being canned for budgetary reasons, And then a year later, The Sun ran a story saying that it was part of the sort of war on wokeness at the BBC. And I have publicly and privately pressured the BBC to issue a clarification that that wasn't the case, and no one has done that. It's hard for me to believe that somebody was actually going out of their way to get rid of the show. But I think for some people there's a sense at the BBC where it's a kind of useful myth to have out there that the corporation is like taking a stand on perceived leftists, because of the kind of criticism and the pressure that it's under from the conservative press, who don't want a balanced BBC, they want no BBC. Why I struggle to answer this question about cancel culture is because my experience is some of the people that have cried the loudest about censorship are some of the thinnest skinned people I've ever come across. We've seen Conservative Party in this country. We see it now almost every day with the Donald Trump's Republican Party. You see the same thing over and over again. They come out, they say we defend free speech. People are too easily offended. Everyone needs to grow up. Words can't hurt you. The blah blah blah. And then when someone says, "I think Donald Trump's not very good at his job," they go, "Oh my God, how could you say that? How dare you say that? The FCC is going to start looking into broadcast licenses for people who say that he's not particularly good at his job." You know, all of the people that cry cancel culture are often some of the thinnest skinned people. And I would be more willing, I think, to engage in a dialogue about whatever we're calling cancel culture if I felt it was happening with people that were acting in good faith. Riyadh Comedy Festival means that I'm not interested in talking to Jimmy Carr about censorship because I don't think he is serious about it.
And you mentioned the United States there. You've toured there before. You mentioned, I mean, given what's going on under Donald Trump, would you feel safe and happy to do your comedy that side of the Atlantic? Would you go to Israel right now on a comedy tour?
I do think that there is this kind of ongoing conversation about whether it's ethical right now to gig in Israel or perform in Israel. And I mean, again, I am unlikely to be invited out there.
Fair enough.
Under the current Israeli regime. It is possibly unlikely that I'll be invited out there. And I think instinctively everybody is against artists. Everybody doesn't like the idea of artistic boycotts instinctively. But the artistic boycott in South Africa was hugely significant in terms of shifting the cultural tide. So when people talk about going out there and performing and that's how you change things, actually the artistic boycott in South Africa, by not going there, a lot of the artists that refused to perform actually moved things forward in that country, perhaps more than they would have done. So I think it's a really interesting area to get into.
When it came to South Africa, the absence of sport, comedy, so on, precipitated change. I mean, away from the South African example, can you think of anywhere where the presence of comedy has affected positive change, be it in shifting societal attitudes, be it influencing government policy, moving autocracies to becoming democracies?
It's a Peter Cook quote about how the cabaret clubs really did a job on preventing the rise of fascism in Germany. There's always been this idea that actually comedy is nice to have, but it doesn't actually move the dial meaningfully. I would say, unfortunately, and I've spent really most of my career answering that question by saying, no, comedy can't change things. Unfortunately, a lot of the comedians who have very, very high profile podcasts in the United States of America may well have had a very decisive and detrimental outcome on that country's history.
For their support for Donald Trump, presumably.
Their support for Donald Trump, a support which several of them have now publicly said that they regret because of the actions he's taken in office. To those people, I would say, if you didn't think he was going to do this, I have a lot of magic beans I would love to sell you for exorbitant sums of money. What I do think is that comedy is often the canary in the coal mine when things are going down the toilet. And I think that governments will often start by censoring comedians. And that is so rather than us being instigators of change, we are bellwethers of bad things that are coming. John Oliver's show that he did in the wake of the Jimmy Kimmel farrago, John Oliver used bits from a documentary about Russia's slide into autocracy. And one of the things that they kept saying was, we wish we'd spoken out earlier when Vladimir Putin took a satirical puppet show that's a bit like Spitting Image off the air because it was making fun of him. And journalists at the time said we didn't think it was that serious a thing. And now when we look back on it, that was the first sign that things were about to kind of go south in terms of free speech. So I'm not sure that comedians can instigate change. But when people start legislating against comedy, that is very often a canary in a coal mine that something very, very dangerous is coming down the road in more broad terms around freedom of speech.
Do you never worry then that people might see you as just a bit preachy, Nish? Or do you see this as the job of comedians ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, I worry about everything all the time. I don't. I am in a kind of existential crisis on a personal level about what I do and the value of it. And in part, the last show that I did was trying to wrestle with that in some instances, because there's part of you that thinks, listen, the ethical thing to do is in stressful times, if you're a comedian, the ethical thing to do is actually to provide people with an escape. That's the best thing you could do, is provide people with escapist entertainment. I was about to do a show. I was doing a show a couple of weeks ago, and it was literally the week after the kind of Tommy Robinson rally in London. And my mum called me and said, listen, are you going to do your material tonight, or are you going to do something fun for a change? And the phrase something fun for a change is devastating in the way that only a mother can absolutely devastate you. The thing that I'm clinging to at the moment is, like, I grew up watching comedians talk about serious things and make them into something that was funny, and watching them, they gave me relief about those particular serious issues. So that's the thing that I've been trying to imitate. So in a sense, the trouble that I've gotten into in my career means that I'm right where I'm supposed to be.
Nish, mindful of your comments earlier about your conversations with members of the public, just to conclude, go on, tell me a joke then. Get my money's worth.
Like, the thing that I think about all the time, and there is a point in Spinal Tap where Michael McKean and Christopher Guest are stood over Elvis's grave. And because it's a mockumentary, they are literally stood over the real Elvis's grave. And they're singing Heartbreak Hotel, and you sort of see this scene of them reacting to Elvis's grave. And then there's a point in it where they're sort of silently contemplating Elvis's grave. And Christopher Guest says, it really gives you a sense of perspective, doesn't it? And Michael McKean says, you know what? It's a bit too much perspective, to be honest. And, like, I think too much perspective is the key joke, maybe ever. Whether you're talking about, the collapsing economic system, especially when you talk about the climate crisis, there are points where you go, you know what, it's actually a bit too much perspective. I do think too much perspective is one of those things that a moment where comedy distills something quite philosophically profound.
My thanks to Nish for joining me on the podcast, and of course to you for listening. If you want to see more from the Sky News Daily podcast team, you can click over on the right on that playlist. And if you want to see more from Sky News, simply click the channel button slap bang in the middle.